The green room was quiet. Not silent, just quiet enough that even the hum of the studio lights felt intrusive. The walls were a soft cream, but there was no warmth in them. It was the kind of place that looked clean because it had been designed by someone who didn't plan to sit there. On the beige sofa sat Denzel Washington, one leg crossed over the other, his back straight, posture calm. The phone in his hand had dimmed minutes ago, but he hadn't noticed. He was staring through it, not at it. His expression didn't betray a thing, but something in his chest had been heavy ever since the invitation came. A young assistant with a headset had stepped in earlier, her voice polite, cheerful, almost too rehearsed. "Mr. Washington, you're livin' 10. He had nodded once. Not because he needed to be reminded, but because he respected people who did their job with poise. Now, with only 7 minutes to go, the energy in the room shifted. Somewhere deep in the building, a crowd laughed at something Brad Pitt had said. Cameras were rolling. Applause signs were flickering. But in Denzel's room, time was moving differently. He didn't come here for applause. He came because silence lately had started to feel like complicity. Brad Pitt's new show wasn't just entertainment. It had quickly become a high-stakes game of intellectual jabs, surprise call-outs, and political traps disguised as clever banter. RTINGs were climbing. People loved it. The internet lived for the moment someone got owned on air. Denzel's team had warned him. It's not just an interview, it's theater. Be ready for a twist. He was ready. But not just for the twist. They didn't know that he'd been quietly preparing for something much deeper. Because this wasn't just TV. This wasn't just Brad. There was something heavier at play. 3 minutes to go. He remembered the call. That changed everything. A senator's aide, whispering over a secure line. Not about a role, not about a movie. About a hearing. About classified footage. About names being dropped on air that shouldn't have been. Denzel's name, oddly, had surfaced not for anything he did wrong, but because he had once refused to endorse a political candidate who'd now been tied to something ugly. That refusal, years ago, made him a target. Now it made him a threat. Brad's show was the stage. Denzel was the bait. But he didn't flinch. He straightened his jacket. He didn't want to embarrass anyone. He just wanted the truth. Showtime, someone called from behind the camera. Curtain. As he walked toward the glowing stage, he caught his own reflection in the hallway mirror. Not the actor. Not the celebrity. Just a man who'd seen too much, felt too much, stayed silent too long. The applause was deafening when he stepped onto the stage. Brad greeted him with a smile that was just a little too sharp, a handshake that lingered a second too long. The camera zoomed in. Millions were watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brad said into the mic, "tonight's guest needs no introduction. Actor, activist, and apparently now political philosopher, Denzel Washington." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Denzel smiled, but his eyes didn't change. "Thanks for having me," he said softly. Brad leaned back in his chair, flipping a blue card casually. "So Denzel, let's get right to it," he said with a gleam in his eye. "You've always said you don't like politics, but you've been pretty vocal lately about, let's say, national security leaks. Should we be worried that Denzel Washington knows something we don't?" The audience laughed, but Denzel didn't, and suddenly, the room began to shift. "Well, Brad," he said, his voice even calm, "sometimes what you don't say on camera says more than what you do." Brad grinned, cryptic. "I like it." "I'm not being cryptic," Denzel replied gently. "I'm being careful. Because people's lives are on the line, and we're not here to play guessing games." Silence, just for a moment. Not a single person in the audience knew whether to laugh or listen harder. Denzel leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on Brad's. "You mentioned leaks," he continued. "I'd like to know which ones. Because last time I checked, the real story isn't who talked, but who hid the truth for years while the cameras were off. Brad blinked. Something behind his smile flickered. "Denzel, this is a talk show," he said quickly, shifting in his chair. Double quotes, "No, Brad," Denzel said, still soft, but sharper now. "This is a court. The court of public opinion. And you just tried to put me on trial. I think it's only fair I get to ask a few questions too." You could hear the air conditioner hum again. Brad tried to recover. "Look, we're just having a conversation. Don't take it personal." "I don't," Denzel said. "But I take truth very personally." From the side stage, a producer waved frantically, trying to signal Brad to shift topics. But Brad leaned in again, stubborn. "So you're saying you have something to reveal?" Denzel looked at him for a long moment. Then, calmly he said, "Not reveal, remind." The screen behind them lit up with a still image. It hadn't been scheduled. It was a courtroom dated 4 years ago. Brad was sitting in the gallery. The case involved a young military translator who'd been jailed for refusing to alter official testimony. Her name was Elia Thorne. She was now serving a sentence under a sealed case file. Denzel glanced at the screen and said, "She tried to warn everyone. And you were there that day." You smiled and said nothing. Brad turned pale. "You called it national interest," Denzel said. "I call it betrayal." The crowd didn't clap. They didn't boo. They didn't breathe. Denzel leaned back. "So maybe tonight, instead of a show," he whispered, "we finally tell the truth." And just like that, Brad Pitt had no card left to flip. The cameras didn't cut to commercial. They just froze. Not technically, but emotionally. The entire room was in a trance. Brad Pitt, once the master of smooth transitions and live banter, sat with his mouth half open, unsure whether to laugh, defend, or just look surprised. The glowing set lights suddenly felt like interrogation lamps, and the studio that usually echoed with applause now hummed with tension. The screen behind them still showed the image. A courtroom bench, a fragile young woman in shackles. Her name burned into the bottom corner of the frame like an accusation. Elia Thorne. Denzel didn't move. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was just being deliberate, like every word. From here on carried weight, and it did. Because somewhere, people were watching this broadcast not for laughs, but for answers. Brad's voice came out low, unsteady. We're not here to debate a classified case." "No," Denzel replied, "but we are here to ask why you, Brad Pitt, sat in that courtroom and said nothing when that young woman was sentenced under sealed evidence." Brad's hand tensed around his cue card. His fingers twitched like he wanted to tear it in half or disappear beneath the desk. "It was a charity event. I wasn't involved. I was just invited." "You were invited by Senator Griggs," Denzel interrupted. "You know what that trial was really about. And you know she wasn't just a translator. She was a whistleblower. She saw files that exposed corruption in military aid packages. Someone wanted her quiet." Brad leaned back. "This is reckless." "Truth always looks reckless," Denzel said. "Especially to people who benefit from silence." The audience didn't cheer. They couldn't. It felt wrong, like clapping at a funeral. But in homes across the country, people were leaning forward. Some were shaking, some were crying, because they remembered the case. And they remembered how fast it had vanished from the headlines. Brad adjusted his earpiece. The producers were begging him to steer the segment elsewhere. Offer him a clip, a memory, a movie reel, anything. Let's take a step back," Brad said finally, trying to regroup. "You've had a long, legendary career. You've played heroes, kings, warriors. Let's talk about your Hollywood journey." Denzel tilted his head. "No," the room blinked. "You don't want to talk about Hollywood?" Brad asked, almost incredulous. "Not right now," Denzel replied. "Not while there's someone sitting in a cell because she told the truth." Brad's face tightened. "You're using this platform to..." To say what people are too scared to say, Denzel interrupted. Yes, his tone was still respectful. He never raised his voice, but it carried like thunder. You want Hollywood stories, Brad? Denzel continued. Here's one. I once turned down a major script, big money, big names, because they wanted me to play a general who covered up a war crime. They said it was fiction. I said it was familiar. The audience stirred. They told me, it's just a movie. But Alia's life isn't a movie. And neither is yours. The only difference is, your silence gets awards. Hers got her chains. That line broke the room. For a moment, Brad looked smaller. Not because Denzel was louder, but because truth strips ego bare. And for the first time in his life, Brad Pitt didn't know what role to play. Behind the scenes, a second screen flickered. It wasn't supposed to air. But it did. Footage began rolling, grainy, but real. A military base, men shouting. A shipment crate being rerouted in the dark. Documents stamped confidential. And a blurry voice, Alia Thorne's voice, saying, if this goes public, they'll ruin me. Brad looked at the monitor. Where did you get this? Denzel said nothing. This was sealed. Denzel stayed silent. The camera zoomed in. Denzel's eyes weren't angry. They were tired. But behind that tiredness was purpose. Finally, he spoke. I didn't come here to destroy you, Brad. I came to remind you. You once said you cared about truth, so do something about it. Brad swallowed hard. We're actors, Denzel. No, Denzel said. We're witnesses. The question is, will we speak? The live feed didn't cut, because by now it was too late. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was history happening. On stage. The show was still technically live, but everything about it now felt unscripted, dangerous even. No music played between segments. No soft jokes filled the air. There was no witty banter to soften the blow. Only the buzz of 1,000 unsaid things and the silent roar of millions of viewers witnessing something raw, something real. Off stage, producers paced behind the curtains like generals in a crisis. Their headsets buzzed with orders. Cut to break. Pull the feed. Cue the apology segment. But none of it happened. Because something unexpected had occurred. The audience refused to look away, and Brad Pitt. He had stopped pretending. His cue cards lay face down. The show outline, once so tightly timed, had crumbled under the weight of Denzel's truths. And somewhere deep in his chest, Brad felt a coldness that fame couldn't shield him from anymore. Not because he'd been exposed, but because he knew Denzel was right. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender. You're assuming I knew everything, Brad said quietly, his voice stripped of charm. But people like you forget, we're just faces on screens. The real decisions, the dirty ones, happen far from here. Denzel didn't blink. You were at the table. Brad exhaled, long and shaky. I was at the table, yes, but I didn't set the rules. Maybe not, Denzel said. But you signed the deal. A hush fell again. Brad looked toward the side stage, as if hoping someone would rescue him from this moment. But no one came. No actor, no script, no exit cue. You want the truth? Brad finally said, his voice hoarse. Fine. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. It was old, creased from too much handling. He laid it on the table between them. That, he said, is the contract. It's what Senator Griggs gave me in exchange for silence. A film partnership initiative to promote defense industry contributions to Hollywood. If I stayed quiet, my next 3 films would get full government cooperation, access, funding, military bases, real jets, real gear, all of it. Denzel didn't touch the paper. He didn't need to. And you said yes? He asked, already knowing. I said maybe, Brad whispered. But they took maybe as yes, and I never corrected them. Why? Brad looked down at his hands. Because I was scared. Scared that if I said no, I'd be shut out. I'd lose everything. The studios, the agents, the fame. He looked. Up again. But then I watched that girl Aliyah stand in that courtroom alone, and I still said nothing. The confession hung there like smoke, filling every corner of the studio. Denzel leaned back, slow and quiet. "It's not too late," Brad shook his head. "Isn't it?" Denzel looked out at the audience, not the one clapping. The one beyond the camera, the forgotten ones, the veterans, the whistleblowers, the families who never got answers. Truth waits, he said, but it never begs. Backstage, a stagehand stepped into the light. Her name tag read Sophia. She was barely 23, but her face looked older today. She held something in her hand, a small USB drive. Brad frowned. "What's that?" "She left it," Sophia said softly. "Aliyah, she sent it to our studio. Last year, they told me to archive it. I didn't." She stepped forward and handed it to Denzel. "I think she wanted someone to play it. Someone who wouldn't be scared." Denzel held the drive like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "And maybe it did." He nodded toward the control booth. "Roll it." The producer hesitated, but something in the room had shifted. The crowd wasn't just watching now, they were demanding. So the screen lit up again. Liah appeared, sitting in a dark room, her voice steady, eyes clear. No makeup, no script, just truth. "If you're seeing this," she said, "it means they didn't silence everything. I don't hate the people who turned their backs. I understand fear. I just hope anyone still believes in justice more than they believe in keeping their careers." The footage faded. No applause. No music. Brad was crying now. Not the tears of an actor. Not the show kind. Real ones. The kind you cry when you realize your silence hurt someone who never had your microphone. Denzel didn't touch him. He didn't need to. He turned to the camera. "The truth was never lost," he said. "It was just locked in rooms like this, waiting for someone brave enough to open the door." The audience finally exhaled. And outside, on the streets, people began to gather, not to protest, not to riot, but to witness. Something had broken loose, and it wasn't going back. Inside the control room, panic had transformed into paralysis. Executives with polished suits and cold eyes stared at the live feed with clenched jaws. What was supposed to be a feel-good celebrity segment had become a global reckoning, and no one had a blueprint for this. Someone whispered into a headset, "We need to cut the feed." But a voice from the far end of the room snapped back, "We cut now, we become the story." That voice belonged to Evelyn Kane, the senior vice president of programming. She was known as the woman who could spin scandal into gold. But even she knew this wasn't scandal. This was something else. This was truth. Unedited. Unstoppable. Her assistant ran over, holding a folder. "Ma'am, you need to see this." Evelyn opened it. Inside were leaked internal emails threads between the senator's office and the network's legal team. The subject line was simple: cooperation agreement, talent placement and narrative. Alignment. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just Brad. The entire network had been participating, shaping public opinion through entertainment, using stars to distract from cover-ups. And now Denzel had cracked the lid wide open, on screen. Denzel and Brad had fallen quiet again. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew the next wave wouldn't come from them. It would come from the world watching. And that wave was already rising. Outside the studio, across Los Angeles, crowds had begun to gather. Not mobs, not protesters, just people. Holding signs, screenshots, pieces of paper with Aliyah Thorne's name. They weren't shouting. They were standing, waiting. Across social media, hashtags exploded. Hashtag justice for Aliyah, Denzel sated, hashtag Hollywood truth, hashtag the contract. Then something unexpected happened. An anonymous Twitter account posted a PDF feed titled simply, "Operation Velvet Curtain." It was real. Unredacted. 37 pages of documentation revealing how public figures had been offered silent deals to push soft narratives, drown controversial topics in pop culture noise, and reinforce political loyalty through fictional heroes. The contracts bore signatures. Brad's was their dot, but so were others. Big names. Respected names. Anchors. Actors. Even directors. And worst of all, Elia Thorne's final testimony, hidden in the sealed court transcript, was page 36. "I don't care about awards," she had said under oath. "I care that my brother died in a war we funded with lies, and now you want me to help you hide them." The PDF spread like wildfire. At CBS headquarters, the phones lit up. Legal teams were already drafting denials, but the momentum was gone. The genie was out of the bottle. Brad sat in his chair like a man remembering everything he wished he could forget. "I didn't read all the documents," he said quietly to Denzel. "You didn't need to," Denzel replied. "You felt it. But you ignored it. I thought." Brad struggled. "I thought it was just how things worked." "It is," Denzel said. "But that doesn't make it right," he turned to the audience. "Everyone always says they're just doing their job, but maybe the job is broken." And that's when she walked in. From the side of the stage, uninvited, unannounced, walked a woman in a black suit with silver glasses. She moved with confidence, her ID badge flashing as she passed the stunned security guard. "Miss Kane?" Denzel asked. Evelyn nodded. "We need to speak." The cameras stayed on. Evelyn stepped forward. "I'm not here to cover this up. I'm here to confirm what you said." Gasps from the audience. "The contracts are real. The cooperation deals were real, and most of us were told it was harmless. But I looked the other way too long." She paused. "So I resign. Publicly right now." The control room exploded. Half the staff ran to stop the feed. But the broadcast signal was already out of their hands. It was being rebroadcast, clipped, mirrored, streamed by thousands across the internet. No button could undo what the world had now seen. Evelyn turned to Brad. "You can still fix this. Not by acting. Not by posting. But by telling the truth in every room they told you to stay quiet in." Brad's voice cracked. "I don't even know how." Denzel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Start with 'I was wrong.' It's more powerful than any role you'll ever play." And at that moment, something shifted in Brad. Not fully. Not instantly, but enough. Enough to face the mirror without turning away. Outside, more people joined. Candles were lit for Elia. Someone painted her face across the side of the building. It wasn't about fame anymore. It was about memory. In memory, when shared, becomes power. 2 days later, the U.S. Capitol was surrounded, not by sirens or armed protests, but by news vans, streaming drones, and stunned citizens holding nothing but their silence. Silence had become the loudest thing in America. A hastily scheduled congressional hearing was underway. It wasn't supposed to happen so fast. But after the leak of Operation Velvet Curtain and the viral broadcast of Denzel and Brad's live confrontation, pressure from the public reached a boiling point. People demanded answers, and more than that, they demanded accountability. Inside the committee chamber, Senator Griggs sat like a man daring the world to blink first. He was calm, dressed immaculately, his hands folded as though this were just another hearing. But behind his poise was a storm. His face had already appeared on news channels for 3 nights straight, and not once in a favorable light. Denzel Washington walked into the hearing room unguarded. No entourage, no PR agent. Just truth, carried quietly. As he stepped to the front, the room turned. The crowd in the chamber wasn't made of fans. It was media, staffers, lawyers, powerful people. And yet, the way they looked at him, you'd think a ghost had entered the room. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind that reminds you who you really are. "Mr. Washington," Senator Griggs said, pretending professionalism, "you're not a legal official. Why are you here? Denzel stepped up to the microphone. I'm not here as an actor, he said. I'm here as a witness. Griggs smirked. Witness to what? Silence, Denzel answered. And the damage it does. He turned slightly to face the room. 3 nights ago, a young woman's recorded testimony was played on live television. Her name was Aliyah Thorne. She was a translator, a whistleblower, and a patriot. She warned us about what was happening with foreign aid manipulation and how high the lies went. And yet, Denzel continued, she was sentenced in secret, sealed case. No public defense. Why? Griggs tried to interject. This hearing is not about one individual case. It is, Denzel interrupted firmly. Because if you ignore one person brave enough to tell the truth, how many others did you bury in shadows? Gasps rippled across the room. Griggs leaned forward. Careful, Mr. Washington. You're making heavy accusations without evidence. I didn't come empty-handed, Denzel said. He placed a black folder on the table. The room went silent. Inside, a printed copy of the Operation Velvet Curtain contract. Attached to it were annotations, timelines, military invoices linked to Hollywood productions. Most damning, a memo signed by Senator Griggs himself, approving the psychological operations framework for public influence through entertainment. Someone gasped. Someone else stood up. A member of Congress asked the clerk, "Is this real?" The clerk nodded slowly. Denzel didn't smile. I've already given copies to every major press outlet. Whether you admit it here or not, the world will know. Griggs stiffened. You think you're a hero? No, Denzel said. I think I'm a man doing what every person should have done a long time ago. The room was crumbling. Masks falling, emails being printed, subpoenas being signed. And in that chaos, Brad Pitt walked in. This time, no suit, no makeup, just himself. He stood in the back quietly. Denzel noticed, but didn't call attention to him. Senator Griggs cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. I move to adjourn this hearing until further notice. But Congresswoman Janine Rivera, known for her integrity, slammed her hand on the table. No, this hearing is just beginning. She turned toward the clerk. Subpoena Senator Griggs and place him under investigation. Explosions of flashing cameras filled the room. Griggs stood, red-faced. This is a political circus. No, Denzel replied softly. This is the truth catching up. Outside the hearing room, Brad waited for him. He looked shaken, but his eyes held something new: resolve. I want to testify, he said. I want to admit what I signed. And everything they offered me. Denzel paused. You sure? Brad nodded. I don't want to be a product anymore. I want to be a person. And as they stood side by side, no roles, no spotlights, something remarkable began happening. People outside began chanting not their names, but Aliyah's. They weren't worshiping celebrities. They were standing for courage, and that was more powerful than any performance. The courtroom was packed, not with press, not with celebrities, not with politicians seeking cameras. It was filled with ordinary people, nurses, teachers, veterans, students who had followed the story of Aliyah Thorne from the moment Denzel spoke her name aloud. Now they had come to see if the justice that failed her once would finally speak her name with dignity. On the witness bench sat Brad Pitt. He was not acting. Not this time. His voice trembled as he read from the statement. He had written himself. No lawyers, no edits. Just truth. I participated in silence, he said. I signed contracts. I took money. I made films that sold lies wrapped in entertainment. I justified it as art, but it was fear. I was afraid to say no. But someone younger, with less power, stood taller than I ever did. Her name was Aliyah Thorne, and she's the real hero of this story. Some people in the gallery cried. The judge didn't interrupt. Not once. Brad turned to the camera. The hearing was now streamed live and said one last thing. I Hope Hollywood's next generation watches this. Because if they ever ask you to trade your soul for a spotlight, don't. The judge called for the next witness. It was Denzel. He didn't read a statement. He didn't need to. He stepped to the stand, took the oath, and then looked directly at Senator Griggs. You had power, Denzel said, and you used it to bury the voices that threatened your illusion. But power without accountability is nothing more than theater. And America's seen enough theater. Griggs didn't respond. Not because he was silenced, but because there was nothing left to say. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the prosecutors stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "with the court's permission, we'd like to submit a final piece of evidence." It was recovered from Miss Thorne's belongings, a sealed letter, addressed to the future. The judge nodded. She handed the letter to Denzel. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. He read aloud. "To the one who finally speaks. If you're reading this, then truth has survived longer than I did. People told me I was naive, that I should stay quiet. But I couldn't, because my brother's last words were, 'Don't let them pretend we didn't exist.' And I promised I wouldn't. So if you're standing where I couldn't, don't just speak for me. Speak for every silenced soul and never stop." Aliyah, no one moved. Not even the judge. Tears streamed silently. Not from pity, but from recognition. Something ancient had returned to the room, something America had forgotten. Conscience. And just like that, the crowd stood, not in protest, not in celebration, but in solemn tribute. Every person in that courtroom stood, except Senator Griggs, because the judge had just ruled, "You are hereby placed under federal investigation. All privileges revoked." Court adjourned. Reporters chased the exit, but the cameras stayed on Denzel. Outside, as he stepped into the sunlight, a young girl approached. No press badge, no mic, just a drawing clutched in her hand. "My mom says you gave her hope," she said. Denzel knelt. "What's your name?" "Aliyah," she said. He smiled. The kind of smile that holds pain and peace together. "That's a beautiful name." She handed him the drawing. It showed Denzel standing on a stage, not as an actor, but as a man. Behind him stood a ghost with wings. Her shirt said, "Truth." That night, Brad went live on his own channel. No filters, no editor. He announced he was starting a foundation, the Thorne Initiative, to support whistleblowers and young filmmakers with stories that needed to be told. Denzel didn't join the board. He didn't need to. His work was already done, not on the screen, but in the heart of a country that had finally looked up and asked, "What have we become?" And more importantly, who do we choose to be now?